Hello there, today we are going to talk about output feedback mode of block ciphers. We will first give you an introduction, then talk about the encryption and decryption process, and finally talk about the advantages and disadvantages. OFB, or known as output feedback mode, is a mode of operation for any given block cipher. It is similar to a CFB, or known as cipher feedback mode, in that it allows encryption of different block sizes. The key difference of an OFB to a CFB is that OFB is the output of the encryption blocks is the feedback rather than the ciphertext used by the CFB as a feedback. In terms of usage by the DES, the output of the encryption is used by the DES as a key for encryption and decryption purposes. During the decryption phase, the OFB needs to pre-compute the number of outputs as much as the number of outputs pre-computed during the encryption phase, and decryption starts with the first output being pre-computed. During the encryption phase, the IV will be generated with a specified number of bits. In this case, we will be using 64 bits for the IV. Then, a 64-bit key input will be used to encrypt the 64-bit IV using a DES block cipher. If the key does not have 64 bits, it need to be padded. An output of 64 bits is now generated from this encryption. The output will now be XORed with the first part of the plaintext, which is 64 bits. If the plaintext does not have 64 bits, it needs to be padded. The output of the first encryption now will be used for the encryption of the second round of encryption. The same key from the first encryption will be used. The 64-bit second output will now be generated from the second round of encryption. The second output will now be XORed with the second part of the plaintext, which is again 64 bits. This process is repeated as long as the plaintext as a whole. Decryption phase is pretty much the same as the encryption phase. In the decryption phase, the IV and the keys needs to be same as the IV and key in the encryption phase. Speaking of the advantage of using OFB is that the block cipher computations are independent or have no correlation with the plaintext. One or several blocks of keystream material can be pre-computed depending on the number of rounds specified. OFB encryption is non-deterministic in that encrypting the plaintext twice or more result in a different ciphertexts. Speaking of the disadvantages, the sender and receiver need to be in sync in terms of having the same IV and be able to know the number of blocks of output to compute or pre-compute during decryption. It was later in time it has been determined by research that OFB 64 should ever only be used. This is all for the time being, and thank you for watching.